Ethan Cole had always been the kind of person who blended quietly into the background. At 23, his world revolved around design sketches, unfinished coffee cups, and long evenings spent staring at blueprints in his cramped apartment. His closest friend, Ryan Carter, was his opposite in every imaginable way, confident, loud, the kind of man who entered a room like he owned it. Yet somehow, their friendship worked. Ethan admired Ryan's freedom, and Ryan often said Ethan grounded him. They had met during their first semester at university and had been inseparable ever since. Ryan's father, David Carter, was a name Ethan had heard long before he ever met the man, a respected architect and owner of one of the city's leading design firms. To Ethan, David wasn't just Ryan's father, he was someone Ethan secretly looked up to, a professional idol whose work Ethan had studied countless times. When Ethan first visited the Carter residence, he had been overwhelmed by its silent perfection, glass walls, clean lines, everything immaculately arranged. It reflected David's personality even before they spoke. David was polite but distant, speaking little, observing much. There was a weight to his presence that made Ethan straighten his posture and choose his words carefully. Months turned into years. Ethan and Ryan graduated, but their friendship remained intact. Ethan found work as a junior designer at a modest firm, while Ryan drifted through opportunities, rarely sticking to one. Despite their differences, Ethan often helped him prepare portfolios or finish presentations. Ryan's father, though rarely around, occasionally acknowledged Ethan's dedication with a small nod or brief comment, enough to make Ethan's heart beat a little faster, though he never understood why. Then, one ordinary afternoon, the call came. Ethan was sketching late at his desk when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen, Mr. Carter, startled him. He hesitated before answering. "Hello, sir." "Ethan," David's voice was calm, deliberate. "I was wondering if you could stop by my office this evening. There's something I'd like to discuss, about Ryan, and perhaps, about you." The way he said it lingered in Ethan's mind long after the call ended. It wasn't a request, it was a summons wrapped in curiosity. He almost said no, he wasn't sure why his heart was racing, but politeness won. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll be there." By 6 o'clock, Ethan was standing in front of the tall glass doors of Carter Design Group. The evening light bounced off the building, giving it a golden edge. As he stepped inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and ink. A receptionist guided him to David's private office. The room was exactly what Ethan had imagined, shelves of architectural models, precise lines of blueprints rolled into cylinders, and large windows overlooking the city's heart. Behind a sleek mahogany desk sat David, composed, immaculate in a charcoal suit. "Ethan, come in," David said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "It's no problem, sir," Ethan replied, sitting carefully. David studied him quietly for a moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I've been watching your work," he said finally. "Ryan tells me you're one of the most committed designers he knows." Ethan felt heat rise to his cheeks. "That's kind of him to say." David smiled slightly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He doesn't say it kindly, Ethan. He says it with envy. You're focused. You have direction. That's rare." The compliment landed with more weight than expected. Ethan tried to deflect with modesty, but David kept speaking, his voice soft, deliberate. He talked about architecture, about the discipline it demanded, about how creative people often lost themselves in distraction. Ethan listened, drawn to the rare warmth beneath David's otherwise cool tone. Then something shifted. David leaned back, fingers steepled. "You know, Ethan, sometimes I look at you and see the kind of person Ryan could be, if only he had your discipline." Ethan looked down, uneasy. "Ryan's just figuring things out. He'll get there." "Maybe," David said quietly. "Or maybe he needs someone like you to remind him what's possible." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy. Ethan could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of traffic below. Something unspoken lingered between them, curiosity, perhaps, or something he didn't dare name. when Ethan finally stood to leave, David rose as well. "Ethan," he said, voice low, almost hesitant, "there's something about you, something I can't quite ignore." Ethan froze, unsure if it was praise or confession. His throat tightened, but words failed him. David's gaze held his for one lingering second, steady, searching, before he turned back toward his desk as if nothing had been said. Outside, the evening air felt colder than before. Ethan walked to his car, heart pounding, replaying every word, every pause. He told himself it meant nothing, that maybe he'd misunderstood. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. For days, Ethan tried to convince himself that the moment in David's office meant nothing. He replayed the words over and over, "Something about you I can't quite ignore." Maybe it was just admiration, he told himself. Maybe David had only meant it professionally. Yet each time Ethan closed his eyes, he could still feel the intensity of that gaze, the strange pull between them that defied explanation. That he threw himself into work, hoping to bury the thought. Ryan was back from his trip, cheerful and careless as ever, talking about new parties, new plans, and how he might finally get serious about something. Ethan smiled, nodding where expected, but his mind drifted elsewhere, to the quiet confidence of David Carter, to the way his voice had softened when he'd spoken his name. One late afternoon, Ethan stopped by the Carters' home to return Ryan's laptop. Ryan had gone out again, leaving the house unusually still. As Ethan was about to leave the device on the table, a voice called from behind him, "Ethan." David stood at the edge of the hallway, sleeves rolled up, eyes unreadable. "You came by. I wasn't expecting that." Ethan hesitated, clutching the laptop bag. "I just wanted to drop this off. Ryan forgot it at the studio." David nodded slowly. "He's out, but you can stay for a cup of tea if you'd like. I've been meaning to ask you something about your designs." It was harmless, Ethan thought. A brief conversation. Nothing more. He followed David into the study, the same room where silence always seemed louder than sound. David poured the tea himself, setting a cup in front of Ethan with deliberate care. "I read your latest proposal," he began. "The concept of contrast and balance, it's impressive. You think deeply for someone your age." Ethan smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. "I just try to understand what feels right." "That's exactly it," David said, leaning forward. "You feel things. You design with emotion, not just logic. Most people lose that." His tone was calm, but his eyes carried an undercurrent Ethan couldn't ignore. The conversation drifted from architecture to life, how difficult it was to stay true to one's instincts, how loneliness could sharpen or break a person. Ethan spoke about his struggles with confidence, about always feeling overshadowed. David listened intently, every word absorbed, every pause treated like something fragile. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," David said softly. "Quiet, searching, and not realizing how remarkable you already are." Ethan looked down, embarrassed. Compliments from anyone else would have felt ordinary. From David, they seemed to reach someplace deeper. "You shouldn't say things like that," he said quietly. "Why not?" David's voice lowered. "It's the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. The sound of the rain tapping against the window filled the room. Ethan's heartbeat echoed in his ears, heavy and confused. He wanted to leave, to escape the gravity pulling him closer, but something in David's expression, something lonely, vulnerable, rooted him to the spot. David stood, moving to the window. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "when Ryan's mother passed away, this house became just walls. Noise without meaning. He filled it with friends, I filled it with work. But lately, when you're here, it feels different. Less empty." Ethan felt the words land like a confession. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to," David replied. His voice trembled, barely audible. Sometimes silence says enough. When David turned, their eyes met. For a single heartbeat, neither looked away. The distance between them dissolved, unspoken emotion replacing logic. Ethan's breath caught. It wasn't a deliberate choice, but rather a surrender to something he didn't understand. Then, as quickly as it began, Ethan pulled away, stepping back, his chest tight with panic. "I should go," he said abruptly. "Ryan might come back soon." David nodded, his expression unreadable again. "Of course. Forgive me if I said too much." Ethan left without another word. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, soaking through his shirt as he walked to his car. He drove aimlessly through the city, thoughts colliding, guilt, confusion, desire, and fear. What was happening between them wasn't love, yet it wasn't nothing either. It was something dangerous, something that blurred every line he thought he knew. The following days were unbearable. Ethan avoided Ryan's calls and messages, making excuses about deadlines. But the weight of what had passed lingered. He couldn't erase the memory of David's voice, the quiet sincerity behind every word. Then, one evening, Ryan cornered him at the university cafe, his tone colder than usual. "My dad's been asking about you a lot lately," he said, eyes narrowing. "More than he ever talks about me. Should I be worried about that?" Ethan froze, the cup trembling slightly in his hand. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Ryan waited a moment longer, then gave a humorless laugh. "You've been different lately, Ethan. I don't know why, but I will find out." As Ryan walked away, Ethan sat motionless, his pulse racing. The truth he had tried so hard to hide was now dangerously close to being exposed. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls, but beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler, I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion, confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired. And as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something